The morning the water in the old quarry dropped below the second ledge, Marina Holt stood at the lip of the cut with a coil of tarred rope over one shoulder and watched a shape rise out of the green that no living person in Del Harrow had seen in 19 years. It was iron, and it was square, and it sat at a wrong angle on a shelf of pale stone that the spring had never uncovered before. She did not move toward it. She had learned from a dead man that the things water gives back, it gives back slowly, and that a woman who lunged at them lost her footing and sometimes more. So she stood, and she counted the inches of new air between the waterline and the stone, and she let the cold come up off the surface and settle on her face, and she understood, the way she understood the color of a good burn, that the drought had finally gone deep enough to be useful. Below her, the quarry held what was left of its water like a hand cupping the last of a spilled thing. The pool had been 40 feet at the deepest in a wet year. Now it was a shrunken oval, the color of bottle glass, and the limestone walls that rose around it were streaked with the high marks of every flood season since the town had flooded the cut on purpose. She knew those marks the way another person knew faces. The pale band at the top was this year. The darker bands below were the years of more water, and the dark stain at the very base where the iron now sat belonged to a depth the pool had not reached since the year they sealed it. Nobody in Del Harrow called the quarry by a proper name anymore. They called it the sump, and they said it the way people say the name of a grave they are not responsible for. The men who had cut stone there were dead or gone south, and the company that had owned the lease had folded its tent and left a hole full of water and a town that had agreed, without ever quite saying so, to never look into it. Verena had looked into it every day for 3 weeks. This is the part where I should tell you what she was. She was 28 years old, and she was a lime burner, which in that country meant she was the person who turned stone into the white powder that built a wall, and bound it and washed it and sweetened a sour field. She had no husband and no land, and a one-room burner's shed at the edge of town with a kiln she had built herself out of the same limestone everyone else despised. She had come to Del Harrow at 19 with a dead mother's wedding ring sewn into her hem and nothing else, and she had walked straight to the only man in the territory who would teach a girl to read stone, and she had asked him, plainly, to teach her. His name was Otho Sange, and he was old even then, and he had looked at her hands for a long while before he said anything at all. What he had said was this. He had said that stone keeps a record, and that fire reads it back to you, and that anybody who learns to listen will never starve and will never be lied to twice. She had not understood him then. She understood him now, standing over a drowned iron box that the town had spent 19 years pretending was not there. Otho had been dead 4 years. He had died in the winter of a cough that no lime could sweeten, and he had left her the kiln and the burner's shed, and a leather roll of tools worn smooth by his hands, and he had left her one more thing she had not understood until the water began to fall. On the last clear afternoon before the cough took his voice, he had asked her to bring him to the lip of the sump, and he had sat on a stone in the cold and looked at the green water for the better part of an hour. Then he had said that the town had drowned more than rock down there, and that a dry year would come, the way a dry year always came, and that when it came, she should be the one standing at the edge. He had not explained. He had only made her promise that she would be the one, and she had promised, because you do not refuse a dying man a thing that costs you nothing. It had cost her 3 weeks of every dawn so far, and now it was costing her the steadiness it took not to climb down at once. She did climb down, but slowly, the way he had taught her, testing each foothold, keeping the rope to her hand. The new bared stone at the second ledge was slick with a generation of green slime gone to gray paste in the sun, and beneath the paste the limestone was the same color it had always been, the dense gray cream stone that the company had quarried and that Otho had burned. She crouched at the edge of the water, an arm's length from the iron, and she looked at it without touching it. It was a strong box. She had seen its like in the freight office and behind the assay scale. A banded iron chest the size of a small trunk, the kind a company used to carry payroll and papers and anything it could not afford to lose. This one had lost its paint to the water and gone the deep brown black of long-drowned iron, and its lid was sealed not only by its lock, but by a thick scab of mineral that the limestone water had laid down over the years, a pale crust like the crust on the inside of a kettle. The box had not simply fallen in, it had been weighted. She could see the corner of a second thing beneath it, the rotten gray of a wagon's running gear, an axle and the ghost of a wheel, as though box and wagon had gone down together and the wagon had been meant to keep the box on the bottom forever. A wagon does not drive itself into a quarry. A box does not lock itself and sink itself. Somebody had done this, in the dark, with intent, and the town had agreed to forget. She knew to the ounce what a thing like that weighed full of water and crusted to the stone, and she had no winch at the edge and no men who would help her, and no wish to ask the men who would not. She did one thing only. She took the short pry bar from the roll at her hip, and she worked its tip under the front edge of the box, not to open it but to feel it, to learn whether it was loose on the stone or grown into it. It shifted, a finger's width, no more, with a grinding cold reluctance, and a thread of black water ran out from under the lid and across the pale shelf and back into the pool. She let the bar out. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the black thread of water until it was gone. Then she climbed back up to the lip, and she did the thing Otho would have done. She went and looked at the records nobody guarded, because nobody believed they said anything. The records were in her own head, mostly, and in the stone. The paper records, though, were in the land office in town, and the land office was a single room with a stove and a railing and a clerk named Pliny Doss, who had held the post for 22 years and had stopped reading anything that crossed his desk sometime in the first 10. Verena had been in that room exactly twice before, both times to pay the fee on her own small parcel. She went in now with a different question, and she asked it in the flat, plain way she asked for anything, which was the only way she knew. She asked Pliny Doss, who had owned the quarry before the company, and when and on what water. He told her because it cost him nothing, and because she was already known in town as a strange, solitary woman whose questions could be answered and forgotten. The quarry, he said, had been opened on a claim filed by a man named Eldon Quillen in the year the town was still 3 buildings and a well. Quillen had cut the first stone out of that hill and had filed, with the claim, a right to the spring that fed the seep at the quarry floor, because a quarry with water in it is a quarry you can mill in and slake lime in and live beside. Then Pliny said, the company had bought Quillen out, fair and square, and Quillen had gone east, and the company had run the quarry for 11 years, and then drowned it when the seam ran out, and that was the whole of it. Verena asked to see the bill of sale. There was a long pause in the warm, dusty room, and Pliny Doss got up and went to a cabinet he plainly had not opened in years, and after some searching he laid a single brittle sheet on the railing between them. It was a deed of sale, signed by Eldon Quillen, conveying the quarry and the water both to the Del Harrow Stone and Lime Company, for a sum of money, on a date in the spring. Verena read it twice. She read the date a third time. Then she thanked Pliny Doss in her level way, and walked out into the wide afternoon with a fact lodged in her chest like a swallowed stone. The date on the bill of sale was 3 weeks after the date carved into Eldon Quillen's headstone. She knew that headstone. She knew every stone in the small burying ground above the town, because she had cut letters into half of them for the families who could not afford the man in the county seat, and she had stood at the Quillen marker more than once and read the worn name and the 2 dates and thought nothing of it. The man had died in the spring of the year the company took the quarry, and 3 weeks after, a dead man is in the ground. A dead man's hand had signed away his land and his water to the men who wanted it. A dead man does not sign. Somebody had signed for him. And the proof of who and how and what it had been worth was almost certainly inside an iron box that the same somebody had sunk under a wagon in the deepest part of a quarry. He then flooded and taught a town to forget Otho had known. He had not been able to prove it or had not lived to, but he had read the same stone she could read, the dense gray cream stone of that hill. And he had known that the only honest record left was the one the water was keeping, and he had given her the one thing he had to give, which was a dying man's instruction, to be standing at the edge when the water gave it back. She was going to need to raise the box, and she was not going to be allowed to. The man who would not allow it was named Cyrus Maddox, and he was the nearest thing Del Harrow had to a founder. He owned the freight line and the general store and the better half of the town's 2 streets, and he had come to the country, people said, as a young clerk for the very stone and lime company that had drowned the quarry, and had stayed and risen and bought up what the company left behind when it folded. He was a tall, dry, careful man in a good coat, with a way of listening to you that made you feel weighed and found wanting. He had never raised his voice in Verina's hearing. He did not have to. He held the assay scale and the freight book, and on the frontier, the man who keeps the books keeps the argument. She did not go to him. She knew better than to announce a thing to the one man it would damage. She went instead to the burying ground in the last of the light, and she sat by the Quillen stone with her tools in her lap. And she did what she had come to do, which was to read it the way Otho had taught her to read everything, slowly and without wanting it to say any one thing. The marker was good limestone from that same hill. The letters had been cut by a careful hand. And down in the lower corner, almost gone to lichen, was a mason's mark. She knew, a small, burned-in monogram that the company's stonecutters had used on the work they did on the side. The man who had cut that headstone had been a company man. The company had buried Quillen. And 3 weeks later, the company had produced his signature. What she did not yet know was how much the careful man in the good coat would do to keep the water from giving the rest of it back. She found out 2 days later when she came to the lip of the sump at dawn and found a man sitting on a camp stool at the only easy way down, with a rifle across his knees and a sack of food at his feet, plainly settled in to stay. He was one of Maddox's freighters, a heavy, slow man named Burl, who hauled lime for her sometimes and was not unkind, and he would not meet her eye. He told her, looking at the water, that Mr. Maddox had bought the quarry parcel off the county that very week, back taxes and all, and that it was private ground now, and that she was not to go down. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been paid to say, and does not entirely believe. Verena looked at him for a while. Then she looked at the water, which had dropped another 2 inches in the night, and she saw that the drought at least was not on Maddox's payroll. She did not argue with Burl. Arguing with the guard is arguing with the man who set him. She turned around and walked back to town, and on the way she understood 3 things in order. The way you understand the stages of a burn. Maddox had known the box was down there all along, the way a man knows where he buried a thing. He had not worried about it for 19 years because the water had kept it. And the first dry year deep enough to bear. It had sent him to the county the same week to buy the ground and post a guard, which meant that whatever was in the box was worth more to him than the price of a quarry full of dead water, and that he was now in a hurry. A man who buys a worthless hole and guards an empty pool is a man telling you plainly that the pool is not empty. She had until the water rose again, or until Maddox got men and tackle to the box first, whichever came sooner. And she had no winch and no help, and a guard on the only easy way down. What she had instead was 19 years of low water marks on a limestone wall, a dead man's tools, and the one kind of knowledge the careful man in the good coat did not possess. He could buy the ground and post a guard at the easy way down. He did not know the hard way down because he had never had cause to learn the stone the way a lime burner learns it. Verena had spent 4 years walking that quarry's rim for the white seams that burned cleanest, and she knew that on the far side, away from the road and the camp stool, the wall stepped down in a series of cut ledges where the company had once taken stone. A broken stair. A careful person could descend to the water without ever passing the man with the rifle. She went home and she did not sleep, and she made her plan the way Otho made a burn, by reckoning every part of it before she lit anything. To raise a strong box crusted to a stone shelf in 8 feet of cold water, alone, she would need to break the mineral crust without dropping the box off the shelf into the deep. She would need to part it from the wagon gear that weighted it, and she would need a purchase strong enough to walk it up the stepped ledges a few inches at a time. She had no engine for that, but her own back, and the oldest machine in the country, which is a rope, a beam, and the patience to use them. She spent the next day building it, where no one would see. On the far rim, above the broken stair, 2 pinyon trunks grew close out of a crack in the rock, stunted and stubborn and rooted deep, and between them she lashed a stout cut beam she carried up in 3 pieces over 2 trips, a beam she had seasoned in her own shed for a roof she had never built. From the beam she hung a block and a coil of the tarred rope, the good rope, the rope she trusted with her own weight. It was a gallows frame and a hoist, the simplest machine there is, and standing under it in the dusk, she thought that Otho would have looked at the lashings a long while, and then nodded once, which from him was praise enough to live on. She went down the stepped ledges before first light, with the rope and the bar and a cold chisel and a short-handled sledge, the 12-pound sledge that had been Otho's and still carried the dent where his hand had ridden the half. The water at the bottom of the stair was black and still and so cold, it took the breath out of her in a single pull. She did not let it stop her. She had burned lime through 3 winters in an open shed, and she knew that the body will do a great deal of work while it is cold if the mind refuses to discuss it. The first morning she did nothing but free the box from the wagon. She worked waist deep and then chest deep, her arms going dead white and clumsy, climbing out to warm them at intervals and going back in, and she set the cold chisel to the place where the box's iron foot was rusted into the rotten oak of the wagon bolster, and she struck it with Otho's sledge, once and once and once, in the slow, even rhythm of a person who knows that hurry breaks the chisel and the hand. Both the blows rang flat and dull in the water. The rotten oak gave up its grip, a fiber at a time. By the time the light was full overhead, the wagon gear had sunk away off the shelf into the green deep with a sound like a swallow, and the box sat free and alone on the pale stone, crusted but loose. The second morning she broke the crust. The mineral scab that the limestone water had laid over the lid across all those years was the same stuff she dealt with every day of her life. The lime the water carried out of the very stone around her, and she knew it the way she knew her own kiln. She did not hammer at it. She wetted it and let it soften the little it would soften, and she set the bar's edge to it at the angle that splits a thing along its own grain, rather than across her strength. And she worked it off the seam of the lid in pale, curved flakes the way you peel scale from inside a kettle, until the seam of the lid showed black and clean, and the lock showed too, a heavy iron box lock, rusted but whole. She did not break the lock that day. She wanted the box up and safe on the rim before she ever lifted the lid, because a thing that has waited 19 years can wait one more night. And because Otho had taught her that the moment you most want to rush is the moment the stone is about to teach you something, and you had better be in a position to listen. That night the guard changed. She saw it from the rim in the last light, 2 men now at the camp stool instead of 1, and a third coming up the road with a mule and a load of timber and what looked, even at that distance, like the iron arms of a block and tackle. Maddox had stopped waiting. He meant to take the easy way down and raise the box with men and a windlass within a day, maybe 2, and there would be nothing she could do once it was in his wagon and on his road. She stood on the far rim above her own gallows frame, with the black hole of the quarry between her and the men with the lamps, and she understood that the next morning was the only morning she had. This is a hard kind of night to spend. She did not spend it the way the fear in her wanted to, sleepless and sick. She made herself eat, and she made herself sleep 4 hours by the simple discipline of lying down and refusing to rise, because a person raises nothing on a shaking arm, and the morning would ask everything her arms had. She woke in the cold dark before any bird and went down to the water one last time with the dawn still an hour off, and the men across the water asleep around their own dead fire. The raising took her 4 hours, and very nearly took her with it. She rove the good rope through the block on the gallows frame, and carried the end down the stair and into the black water, and made it fast around the box with a hitch Otho had drilled into her hands until she could tie it blind, a hitch that bites harder the more it is loaded and will not slip. Then she came up the stair and put her weight to the fall of the rope, and the box did not move. She had known it would not at first. A thing crusted to stone holds with the whole flat of itself, and you do not pull it straight up. You break it loose along one edge, and then the next you walk it. So she went back down and set the bar under the front lip, and pried while she could not pull. And she felt the box rock, the suck of the bottom let go of it, and the black water clouded white with the lime she had loosened, and she scrambled back up and threw her weight on the rope again before the bottom could take its grip back. It came then, by inches. The block doubled her strength, and the gallows frame held, and the pinion roots held, and she walked backward up the cut ledges, with the fall of the rope cutting her hands through the wet leather of her gloves, and the box rose dripping out of the green water an inch, and then a hand's width, and then more, swinging and grinding against the lower ledge, until she snubbed the rope and went down again and freed it, and came up and hauled again. There was a moment near the top, with the box clear of the water and hanging full of black weight, and her arms gone to water themselves, when she felt the whole reckoning of the thing tip toward losing it, when one more failure of her grip would have sent it down to the bottom forever. She did not let go. She set her boot in a seam of the rock she had marked the day before for exactly this, and she took 3 breaths, and on the third she hauled the box the last 2 feet onto the broad pale shelf at the head of the stair, and fell down beside it, and lay with her cheek on the cold iron. The sun was well up when she sat back across the water. The men were stirring, and one of them was pointing, and she could hear, faint and flat over the still pool, a voice raised in the first edge of alarm. They had seen the rope on the far rim, they had seen the box on the shelf, and there was nothing they could do about it from the easy way down, except shout and send a man the long way around, and the long way around would take him the better part of an hour over ground she knew, and he did not. She did not run. She had not raised the box to carry it off which she could not have done in any case, a thing that weight, alone up that stepped wall. She had raised it to open it, here in the morning light, on the stone of the place itself, with witnesses already gathering on the far rim, whether they liked it or not. She set Otho's cold chisel to the rusted box lock and took up his sledge and broke the lock in 3 blows. Clean, and the 3rd blow opened it, and she lifted the lid of the strong box on its stiff black hinges into the first daylight it had seen in 19 years, and the cold air that came out of it was the cold air of a sealed thing. And she leaned over it and looked at what the town had sunk. The water had gotten in. Over 19 years, the way water always does. The box, though, had been packed with intent by a man who meant it to keep, and the things in it that mattered had been wrapped in old hide and sealed in a tin canister with a soldered lid, and the canister had held. Verena lifted it out and set it on the iron, and worked its lid free with the chisel point, and inside, dry and brown and whole, were papers. She did not read them all there. She read enough. There was a deed of sale, the true one, drawn in a careful hand and signed by Eldon Quillen in a strong living signature, with a date in the early spring conveying his quarry and his water to the company for a sum of money 4 times the sum on the deed in the land office. And clipped to it was a letter, in another hand entirely, a hand she would later match to old company ledgers, instructing that the true deed and the cash both be held back, that Quillen be paid 1/4 of the agreed price, and that should Quillen make trouble before the season was out, the matter would be settled by other means. Quillen had made trouble. The headstone said he had died that spring. The land office said his signature had sold the quarry 3 weeks after he was buried, for 1/4 of what the true deed in this box said he was owed, and the hand on the letter that ordered him, held back and settled by other means, was a hand Verena had seen 100 times, on freight bills and store accounts and on the very receipt she had signed for her own kilnstone. It was the careful, dry hand of the young clerk who had come to the country with the company and stayed to own the town. It was Cyrus Maddox. She was still holding the letter when Maddox himself came around the long way at last, on a good horse with 2 men behind him on foot, and reined up on the broad shelf a dozen feet from her with the open box between them. He did not shout. She had known he would not. He looked at the box and at the canister and at the papers in her wet, ruined hands. Something moved behind his careful face that she had never seen there. The brief, naked look of a man who has spent half his life not thinking about a thing every single day. He tried, even then. He was not a stupid man, and he did not waste his breath on threats he could not keep in front of his own freighters. He told her in his weighed and reasonable voice that whatever she thought she had found, it was old paper and rust and a dead man's grievance, that the deed in the land office was the deed of record and had been for 19 years and would stand, that a strange woman with no land and no name pulling rotten paper out of a quarry would not be believed against the recorded title and the men who held it, and that she would do better to put it back in the water and go home to her kiln and her quiet life. He said it well. It was the speech of a man who had kept the book so long he had forgotten that a ledger only rules while everyone agrees to read it. Verena did not argue. She had never won an argument against the man with the good coat, and she did not try to start one now. She did the one thing he had never once seen her do, which was to set the papers down out of the wet, carefully, on the dry crown of the iron box, and pick up instead the deed of sale from the land office, the false one, which she had borrowed from Pliny Doss that very week against a fee and a signature, and lay it beside the true one in the morning light, where Maddox's own 2 freighters could see them both. And then she read the stone, She read it the way Otho had taught her, not as an accusation, but as a fact that anyone with eyes could check, and she made the men check it. She pointed to the headstone limestone, a chip of which she had carried up in her satchel, gray cream and dense, cut and dated in the spring. She pointed to the deed of sale signed 3 weeks after that date. She pointed to the true deed from the box, signed in the same living hand as the man whose grave bore that earlier date. And then she told them the one thing only a lime burner could have told them, the thing that turned old paper into proof. The canister had been soldered shut with lead, and lead carries a maker's mark and a cast date in the alloy that a burner learns to read. And the solder on that canister had been run by the company's own tinsmith in the spring of Quillen's death, because she had burned beside that same tinsmith's mark on a dozen sealed lime tins in Otho's shed. And Otho had taught her to read the year in the metal, the way he taught her to read the year in the stone. The box had been sealed the same season. The man died. It had not been sunk by accident, and it had not been sunk later. It had been packed, sealed, weighted, and drowned by someone who needed Quillen's true price and Quillen's true deed never to surface. In the very season the man went into the ground. It was not an argument. It was a thing the men could see and check. With their own hands, a date in stone and a date in lead and a dead man's living signature. And the two freighters looked from the deeds to the headstone chip to the canister, and then, slowly, at Cyrus Maddox. Maddox did not break, or rage, or run. He was past all that. He stood on the shelf with the quarry he had drowned at his back and the proof of what he had drowned in front of him. And he understood, in the one brief moment a chronicle allows him, that the water had kept a better account than he had, and that the woman he had dismissed as a strange solitary lime burner had read both accounts to the bottom, while he was buying a worthless hole to hide the difference. He said nothing more. There was nothing left for him to weigh. The rest took longer than a morning, because justice on the frontier is slow and made of paper and patient men. And Verena had no taste for the part of it that happened in the county seat with lawyers. It happened all the same. The true deed and the soldered canister and the dated stone went before a judge who could read all three, and the recorded title that had stood for 19 years did not stand against them, because a signature dated 3 weeks after a burial does not stand against anything once a single honest man agrees to look. Cyrus Maddox lost the quarry he had stolen, and the better half of the town he had bought with the proceeds, and he left the country the way the company had left it before him, quietly, owing more than he could carry. The town did not cheer. The town had agreed to forget for 19 years, and a town does not enjoy being shown the thing it agreed to forget. It came around all the same, the way a town comes around, one quiet acknowledgment at a time, until the men who had laughed at the strange woman at the sump were the men who tipped their hats to her on the street and did not quite meet her eye. The thing she had done it for was not the judge's order. It was a woman named Sally Quillen, the dead man's daughter, who had been a girl of 9 the spring her father died, and had been told all her life that he had sold the family's water for 1/4 of its worth and left them poor by his own bad bargain, and had carried that shame across 19 years. Verena wrote to her plainly, and Sally came back to the country she had been taken from as a child, an ordinary tired woman in a plain coat, and stood at the lip of the sump, where the water was lower than it had ever been. Verena gave her the true deed and the canister and the headstone chip, and she told her, in her level way, what the stone and the lead and the paper said, which was that her father had not sold his family short and had not made a bad bargain. He had been cheated, held back, and settled by other means, and he had been right, and the proof had been waiting at the bottom of the water for the dry year that would give it back. Sally did not weep, or not much, and she did not thank Verena with a speech. She said, only looking at the water, that her father had always said the stone was honest, even when the men were not. Then she folded the true deed once, and held it against her. And that was the whole of the restitution, and it was enough. The drought broke that autumn, the way droughts do, and the rains came, and the sump began to fill again, ledge by ledge, until the pale stone where the box had sat went back under the green, and the high marks on the wall began to climb. Verena watched it fill from the rim one cold morning with Otho's 12-pound sledge across her knees, and his cold chisel in the roll at her hip. And she did not feel the triumph the men of the town seemed to expect her to feel. The saying of a thing that had needed saying for 19 years. She felt the way she felt at the end of a good burn, when the stone has given up everything it held, and the fire has read it all back, and there's nothing left to do but let it cool. She had been the one standing at the edge when the water gave it back, the way a dying man had asked her to be. And she had read what it gave back the way he had taught her, and she had handed it to the person it belonged to, and she had kept nothing for herself but the tools and the knowing. She went back to the burner's shed before the snow. The kiln needed loading, and there was lime to burn for a chimney. A family 2 ridges over could not otherwise build, and the work did not care what she had proven, or to whom. She loaded the stone the way she always had, the dense gray cream stone of that same hill, and she lit the burn at dusk, and she sat by it through the cold of the first hours, as the old man had shown her, watching the color come up in the fire mouth, waiting for the white. And when the burn went right and the stone began to give, she put her hand flat against the warm wall of the kiln she had built with her own hands out of the thing the country had thrown away. And she held it there a while, and that was the closest she came that autumn to saying anything at all.